All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Betty Cruz, and I'm the president and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Pittsburgh. It's so great to be here with you. Today, we commemorate Earth Day. The first Earth Day was recognized in 1970. Now, more than 1 billion people participate every year as a day of action to change human behavior and create global, national, and local policy changes. You can visit earthday.org to learn more about the day and ways to take action on the climate crisis around the world. Our work at the World Affairs Council of Pittsburgh is centered on bringing people together around global issues, and climate change is one of the, if not the, most important issue of our time, as it impacts so many other areas, from the displacement of people to the economy to conflict, all rooted in the home we all share on this earth. Now, before jumping into today's program on national and regional efforts around climate change, we want to acknowledge for all who are joining us from around the region and around the world that we are located in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the unceded ancestral lands of many indigenous people, including the Seneca, Lenape, Osage, and Shawnee. Through this acknowledgement, we invite you to join us in paying respect to the elders, both past and present. Thank you. Now, let's get into today's program. We are honored to welcome Steve and Shanti. We're on first name basis here. Steve is a senior advisor in the State Department's Office of Global Change, and Shanti is an associate professor at the University of Pittsburgh. They will provide insight into the great challenge posed by the climate crisis and speak to national and regional efforts. Let's turn it over to our panelists to introduce themselves and get today's conversation started. Steve, would you like to go first?
Sure, happy to. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Folks, happy Earth Day. My name is Steve Dyokas, and I'm a Foreign Service Officer for the U.S. Department of State. Dialing in today from Washington, D.C., where I'm based now. I've been with the department about 20 years, covering a range of climate, energy, science and technology, and economic issues with countries mostly in East Asia and Europe. Overseas, I've served at the U.S. embassies in Australia, Japan, and Montenegro, and the U.S. Consulate General in Shanghai, China. Here in Washington, I've covered issues ranging from trade policy to science and technology cooperation and political relationships with the European Union. I would say that one of my favorite parts of our job is talking to Americans about what we do, because we spend so much of our time and attention talking to audiences overseas, but who often have a much better understanding of what the U.S. is doing in a lot of international space than many Americans do. So it's a great pleasure to join your audience here today and share a few thoughts on what the U.S. government is doing around the world to lead the effort to combat the climate crisis.
Thank you so much, Steve. Shanti.
Hi, I'm Shanti, and I'm an associate professor at the University of Pittsburgh. I work on energy, environmental, and economic development issues. Recently, I published a book called America's Energy Gamble: People, Economy, and Planet. And the book deals with the 4 years of energy policies under the Trump administration. And the general message is that every single American has work to do in order to protect our economy and our planet. And we need to wake up and do those much needed. But it's an urgent problem, but we also have agency to deal with it. Previously, I worked on another book in which I was a contributing editor. It's called The Shale Dilemma, dealing with the decisions of countries across the world, whether to go down the path of shale extraction or to avoid that altogether, and what are the trade-offs involved in that. So I look forward to chatting with everybody.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you both for your introductions, about your sharing a bit more about yourselves. The program format for today is that I have a few questions for our panelists, but we definitely want to hear from you in the audience. So please send in your questions, put them in the chat if you're joining us on Zoom, or in the comments if you're joining on Facebook, and we'll be sure to get to those. We also have some questions that were submitted in advance from young people in our network, so we're excited to share those as well. Now let's get right into it. According to the latest report by the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it's highlighted that greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise. and current plans to address climate change are not ambitious enough to limit warming to 1.5 Celsius above pre-industrial levels, which is a threshold scientists believe is necessary to avoid further catastrophic impacts. Can you each speak to what you see as the greatest hurdle in the fight against climate change? Steve, from a national perspective, Shanti, from a regional perspective. Steve, let's start with you.
Sure, thanks. Certainly the IPCC has been dominating our work here in Washington and been featured in media headlines here in the States and around the world. And it really does. There were two actual IPCC reports this year, and they paint a pretty dire picture of what we face if we don't take action. A lot of analogies used, house on fire, 3-alarm blaze, urgent call, a lot of very, very stark language, I think, to get people to really listen and pay attention. But we always say the good news is we know what the solutions are. We have the technologies in hand to make the significant changes that we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions as quickly as possible. And we have more and more finance every day to finance that change, to make those big changes to our economies here in the US and around the world. So we know what the answers are. We made significant progress last year, 2021, as with the new Biden administration came in and very much put climate change front and center in both domestic and foreign policy. And Secretary John Kerry, who was formerly our Secretary of State, now our Special Presidential Envoy for Climate Change, traveled the world, even in the midst of the COVID crisis, of all countries around the world. So as everyone knows, we had 195 countries sign on to the Paris Agreement in 2015. And central to the Paris Agreement was that all countries, big, small, developed, undeveloped, would play a role and make a nationally determined contribution to helping solve the climate crisis. Through his ambition and a lot of partners around the world who are very eager to have the US back and actively engaged, similarly made ambitious pledges. We in the US increased our commitment to cut carbon dioxide emissions 50 to 52% by 2030. A lot of other partners followed suit. So we now have about 65% of the global economy with a specific plan which can be verified and measurable to get us to that 1.5 degree temperature limit, which we're really striving for. That's the good news. The bad news, of course, we still have 35% of the world, which we still need to get on board. But at the COP26 meeting, Conference of the Parties, the UN Climate Convention last year in Glasgow, Scotland, all the parties there agreed to commit this year, 2022, to submitting updated NDCs, these promises or pledges of what action they would take by 2030. So we continue to make a big push this year in 2022 to make sure that everyone, 100% or as close as we can get to the global economy, has a plan to reduce their carbon dioxide emissions and greenhouse gas emissions to keep us on track to avoid the worst consequences of climate change.
Thank you for that, Steve. Everyone being a key word there in the collective efforts that's needed here. Shanti, what are some of the greatest challenges faced by the Pennsylvania region in taking more decisive climate action?
Okay, just to follow up very briefly on Steve's point that yes, the United States has made commitments to reduce our emissions. Those pledges are really, really important. And we in Pennsylvania and across the United States needs to back up with support for the Build Back Better plan, which we actually need those provisions in the Build Back Better plan to be able to achieve those pledges in cuts, right? So from an international perspective, US credibility really relies on what we can achieve domestically. So that's a shout out for what we need to do. In Pennsylvania, I think under business as usual, we will have 70 to 80% reliance on natural gas for electricity generation in a decade or so. This is extremely significant, and it would actually expose us to significant price volatility. So even if you don't think about climate change, from just a narrow economic perspective, it's going to be tremendously difficult for consumers in Pennsylvania if we continue business as usual. The good news is that wind, solar, demand response storage has a clean energy response, has a group, it can be price competitive even in Pennsylvania. So, and we do have another good piece of news is that we have proposed legislation in in Pennsylvania to be able to achieve the shift towards renewable energy. And we also have legislation in Pennsylvania um, thinking about how we are going to transition fossil fuel reliant workers and communities into a more diversified economic base.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Shanti. And we'll dig in a bit more into what that means from a regional impact area. I want to get a little bit, I know we're just scratching the surface in terms of the crisis itself, but we want to also get into some of the solutions. Steve, as a senior advisor in the State Department with obviously many years of experience working for the US government abroad, you know firsthand the ways diplomacy can advance efforts around global issues as a whole. This is especially true for the climate crisis. Can you talk to us about the ways the United States is currently moving climate efforts forward through diplomacy?
Sure, thanks for the question. It was really striking. I was still in Australia on my previous assignment on the first day of the new administration. And with the time difference, we were surprised with a phone call from Secretary Kerry's staff. It was still the evening of Inauguration Day, January 20th, and he wanted to set up a phone call with his Australian counterpart to talk about the imperative of working together on climate change. So this was literally day one of the new administration, putting this front and center with all of our partners around the world, all of our allies, and countries which, quite frankly, we sometimes have had disagreements with over climate policy. As I said before, all of us need to be working together. So this has been front and center for us, but not just the State Department. This is really a whole of the US government effort. And so agencies we think, which of course would be involved in climate change, the Department of Energy, the Environmental Protection Agency, certainly very much involved, but much broader range of agencies involved. The Treasury Department, so determining where will we be supporting financial flows around the world to developing countries that simply don't have the resources to make the changes they need to adapt. Most of these countries are not significant producers of greenhouse gas emissions, but they're on the front lines of the impacts of them. So how can we help these countries? Working with the US Agency for International Development, historically a development-focused agency working on things like health and clean water and education, but now very much front and center. They just put out a new strategy yesterday of how USAID will be one of the lead agencies for us working around the world with partners to help prepare for the impacts of climate change. So this has really become a central element of what we do domestically and internationally. The world really does starve for leadership in the climate space. And Secretary Kerry, when he took over, very early on, he was saying we have to approach being out of the game for 4 years with humility, that a lot of countries will look and say, well, can we really trust that you're going to be with us? And if we make significant changes to our economies and the way we do business in our country, that you'll be there with us in 2 years or 4 years or 8 years' time. And we also have to approach with honesty of we are not close to where we need to be in terms of making the changes to our economies, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and preparing for the future. But as I said before, we do have the solutions, and we need to make, if we get to net zero emissions by 2050, which we have agreed to, 195 countries around the world, we need to make significant action this decade. And so what we need to do by 2030, reduce these emissions by about 45%. We have those technologies in hand today. It's simply a matter of finance and scaling up what we have to make those changes, some big, some small, many medium-sized, around the world, that we can impact the situation where we're at, that every citizen, every corporation, every agency across the country and across the world can really play a helpful role in this.
Thank you. Shanti, you started to touch on this, but if we can go a little bit deeper on Pennsylvania, which has seen some important debates on taking decisive climate action. Can you talk about some of the initiatives in Pennsylvania to address climate change?
We have the most significant one, I would say, is Reimagine Appalachia. Reimagine Appalachia is a group of labor organizations, environmental organizations, civic organizations coming together to think strategically about how are we going to diversify our economy. So thinking about both simultaneously deploying clean energy and making sure that we invest in our fossil fuel communities to be able to shift out of renewable energy. We need to do both because our fossil fuel communities have been the generator of energy that propelled us to wealth, and we have a social contract to address their needs in moving forward. So some of the very exciting work listeners should look out for is work by Appalachian Voices, who has spearheaded many investments into solar and into communities in economic diversification. Invest Appalachia, which is focusing on trying to get organic growth within our region for economic diversification. And then some ones that you guys know about, which is Governor Wolf launched the initiative to source 50% of the state's electricity from solar. This makes sense both environmentally and financially because you actually save by having purchase power agreement for solar over reliance on just natural gas generation. We have legislation in our right now in our state on community solar with bipartisan support. Last count, I think, was 47 bipartisan support for it. This would enable many things. So first of all, subscribers who can't do rooftop solar will be able to do shared panels. So we can potentially reduce our our electricity bills. At the same time, it opens up economic opportunities for farmers to be able to lease out land, the less productive areas in their holdings for solar panels. So it's a win-win in terms of getting revenue to local communities and local farmers, at the same time reducing our electricity needs. There's also another important proposed legislation, which is to use revenue from the RGGI program. At the moment, Pennsylvania is trying still very hard with Governor Wolf's efforts to move into this cap and trade program. And using the revenue proposal to use the revenue from the cap and trade program to finance economic diversification of fossil fuel reliant communities. So I'm very excited about the kind of thinking that has gone on in our region about this dual approach, both deploying clean energy and at the same time ensuring fossil fuel communities are not left behind. And there is significant commitment to both goals.
Great. Let's stay with you. Go ahead, please.
No, I was going to just jump in on Shanti's point that exact situation that we're facing in Pennsylvania, we're seeing around the world. And so that's a big part of our diplomatic efforts of countries as diverse as Germany and Australia and Japan and South Africa are facing this same issue of how do we help these communities, which are historically have powered our economies for decades, if not centuries. How do we help them transition to new opportunities? And we often talk about in the U.S., one of the biggest, the fastest growing employment jobs in the country is solar panel installer, wind technician. I think it's like number 3 or number 4. So we have a lot of economic opportunities here. And I would just spotlight one thing that we just actually went live today on the State Department. We did a great series of videos involving the Mill 19 project in Pittsburgh, which is transitioning from one of the world's longest, steel rolling facilities in the world to a giant solar hub. And it's a great little video about how one community is making this transition and really seeing it as an opportunity to grow in an entirely new direction. And the example of Pittsburgh, we hold up around the world in many different venues as a sort of a model for how to make that transition from a heavy industry, fossil fuel dependent community to one that's really a very dynamic economy that's leveraging its enormous resources in the knowledge sector, finance, healthcare, education, to become a global hub. And I think that's the first G20 meeting that we held in the US in Pittsburgh back in 2009 at the beginning of the Obama administration really highlighted that. Well, actually, the September of this year, the Clean Energy Ministerial Mission Innovation, headlined by the Secretary of Energy, Jennifer Granholm, will also be taking place in Pittsburgh. Again, showcasing the transition that we've successfully made in Pittsburgh to countries from around the world, which will join with their energy and climate ministers to find ways that we can work together with industry in particular, where we can make some really significant changes by employing a lot of the technological solutions we have for short term, but also thinking how can we work together about the longer term needs, getting us to 2050, where some of the, in any process like this, the later steps are often the hardest ones, the ones that we put off to the end. So using collective action, working together, sharing our best ideas to make sure that we can get all the way where we need to be by 2050.
To add to Steve, I think a significant amount of the work that's being done is being done by grassroots organizations. Like I mentioned, Appalachia Voices. Reimagine Appalachia is a group of many environmental, labor, and civic organizations that are doing on-the-ground work, which I think need to be also highlighted. I think we sometimes may spotlight the work of industry and the ads and mats quite significantly, but not highlight the significant amount of work that's going on by the groups that are within Reimagine Appalachia. So a shout out to all those.
Excellent, excellent. And we'll put these resources, the link that you mentioned, Steve, the community organizations that you're mentioning, Shanti, we'll share this with our audience after today's session. Such important points. Let's talk a little bit about natural gas. Pennsylvania is the second highest exporter of natural gas in the entire United States. And the recent sharp rise in gas prices have led to arguments that expanding drilling would be one strategy to reduce the cost of natural gas to consumers. However, others have called into question these assumptions. Shanti, why don't we go to you first? Can you elaborate more on this debate?
Okay, so natural gas is now a commodity that's very much linked to the international markets. So Pennsylvania, although we are extracting natural gas in our region, this does not mean that the natural gas is being consumed only in the region or only in the US, but it's now linked to the international markets. This is very key to understand this point. So even if one were to expand natural gas drilling and production in Pennsylvania, you would scarcely make a dent in the price of natural gas. As long as there is going to be expectation of scarcity, there will be higher prices. So in other words, in order to insulate consumers in the US from fluctuation in price volatility in gas prices, we need to shift out of reliance on fossil fuels. And I think there is also a lot of debate going on about maybe some criticisms of the Biden administration that oil prices are rising, and it's because of the Biden's policies. It makes those claims are completely untrue, because again, oil is a natural, a global commodity, which means prices again are going to be set by perceptions of scarcity, which means again, the only way to insulate consumers from high oil prices is to actually reduce our dependency on oil. So in other words, this is the time, we should have done this 20 years ago, but we should start whenever we can to shift out of reliance on fossil fuel dependency. That's the only way to protect our consumers.
Steve, would you like to add?
Yeah, exactly. We've seen this certainly on the international scene come into very sharp focus after the start of the Russian war in Ukraine, where energy security, which had always been sort of talked about as an issue, we should focus more on energy security, has really become front and center in both in people's lives, but also broader political and diplomatic discussions. And I would fully agree that the solution here to price volatility and energy security concerns is make the transition to clean energy as quickly as possible. The wind, solar, geothermal, hydro, whatever power, nuclear power that we want to do domestically, those are the solutions that are not going to be subject to international price volatility. We're not paying resources to petrostates or dictators around the world, that we are both, having significant economic impacts, keeping prices predictable and in line, reducing our greenhouse gas emissions overall, and becoming a little bit more energy secure in our future. And so that is certainly, I know there's been a lot of discussion in the media, like, can we really do both at the same time? Can we focus on making this transition while also meeting the energy needs of today? And we would say, yes, we can do both. That we need to keep the lights on. We need to keep our economies going. And we will be continuing to use fossil fuels for an indefinite period of time. The question is this the time to be building new resources and expanding capacity in the future, or using this as the impetus to make the transition to clean energy as quickly as possible?
Just to follow up on Steve's point, one of the arguments that has been made in Pennsylvania is that we need to expand drilling in order to send natural gas via LNG to Europe. This is not going to solve the problem in the immediate run, because building out LNG terminals takes years, right? And what we run the risk of doing is running the risk of investing in terminals that will become stranded assets, because the EU has already announced that its game plan is, yes, to shift its imports of natural gas away from Russia to other sources, but more importantly, to shift completely out of fossil fuels, including natural gas. So there's a danger of Pennsylvania going down the route of investing in LNG terminals, in pipelines, and whatsoever, and ending up with stranded assets, with buyers deciding to go all off natural gas.
Thank you for that additional point. We've talked about the role of the public sector, the role of grassroots organizers and community-based organizations. What about the role of the private sector? So in addition to diplomacy between countries, partnerships between the public and private sector offer opportunities for addressing this crisis as well. Steve, how do you see the US government and the private sector working together? Anything specific that you might want to pull out in terms of initiatives from the administration?
Sure. No, this is front and center in what we're doing. That is, Secretary Kerry says, there is no government in the world, let alone collection of governments in the world, that can provide the finance which is necessary to make this clean energy transition around the world. And so working with the multilateral development banks like the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank, that's a big part of what we're doing. But also working directly with the private sector, as there is trillions of dollars of assets around the world looking for a home, looking for places to be spent. And there are enormous opportunities on every continent on Earth of investing in new energy solutions, which will pay good returns, power our economies, and make everyone much better off. So the finance piece is certainly a big part of it. Another element that we're working on, and one thing we announced last year at the COP meeting in Glasgow, Scotland, was the formation, the US working with the World Economic Forum on something called the First Movers Coalition. So this is a collection of companies, so about 35 already, with a market capitalization of over $6 trillion, making advanced commitments to purchase new technologies in very hard to abate sectors of the economy. So things like aviation, shipping, trucking, and steel production, which are often avoided or overlooked because simply the technical challenges of reducing greenhouse gas emissions from there are very, very difficult. But having big airlines like United or delivery companies like Amazon making commitments that by 2030, a certain percentage of their fuel around the world and all their operations will be fully sustainable, or a certain percentage of their ships will be entirely carbon free by 2030. So working with those big movers that will help create markets where they don't currently exist, where some of the technologies may exist, but not on the scale that's required. But having a big company putting their sort of their cards and saying, this is what we're committed to. Everyone else, we welcome you to join with us. The more partners we have working with us, the more companies employing these technologies, the faster their price drops. I mean, we look at the cost of solar technology now to where we were 10 years ago, and there's been a massive drop in the cost. And in most parts around the world, most places around the world, the cost of building a new solar plant is much cheaper than building a new gas-powered plant or coal-powered plant or anything else, simply because the scale is so large that when we have such broad diffusion of technology, the costs come down for everybody. So helping with these main giant corporations to really set a new pathway forward. So working with big companies, but also as Shanti mentioned, we're working with partners of all sizes. Every company, big, medium, and small, can make decisions in their daily operations, or they look out 1, 5, 10 years into the future. How can they make a contribution, which, increasingly we're seeing in financial markets around the world, of investors are becoming much more demanding on knowing what, their companies that they're investing in, are they meeting ESG standards in terms of sustainability and reliability, and making decisions on corporate boards. Are we going to push to remove directors who are not sort of walking the walk on this? And it's become a very, very active space, and one that honestly, because of the scale of the private sector in the US and around the world, really will be able to make enormous impacts in ways that governments, even everyone, 195 countries working together, will not be able to achieve. So it really is, it's a whole of government, whole of society solution that we're seeking.
Just to add to Steve's point, I think what's important going on right now is the SEC, the Security and Exchange Commission, has proposed a regulation that would require companies to disclose their climate risk. This is really important because it enables investors to understand what is the risk of putting their money in one source versus another. With this way, you can incentivize the shift of private funds away from assets that are going to have significant climate risk to greener investment opportunities. I also want to highlight to your audience one potential issue that we need to face in our state legislators. So Steve mentioned that ESG, responding to ESG concerns, environmental, social, and governance concern, is a concern about many, many investors. However, there are some state governments in the US right now that are trying to pass legislation that would disallow their pension funds from contracting with companies that quote unquote discriminate against oil and gas. So these companies are shifting their funds out of oil and gas, out of economic prudence, financial prudence, but they are being, but state governments in some oil and gas states are actually preventing pension funds from contracting with these companies, which is kind of setting Steve mentioned that, ESG investments are attractive from an investor's perspective, but we are putting in laws to prevent prudent decision-making in the private sector, which is problematic. Very anti-market kind of approach.
Shanti, let's stay with you. You recently published the book, America's Energy Gamble, People, Economy, and Planet, which addresses US energy policies during the last 4 years. What are the key messages? I don't know if they riff off of what you're just adding, these insightful points that you're adding now, but can you share a little bit more on those key messages or lessons that we can draw on from your research?
I think the main message is that any pro-fossil administration, so any pro-fossil administration that may come in, can entrench oil and gas extraction in the US and our dependency if Congress does not take action. So many environmental protection and economic protection responsibilities lie with Congress in terms of being able to legislate laws to deal with climate change, cutting emissions, funding, shifting our taxpayer funds away from subsidizing oil and gas towards helping and investing in just transition. Those are all responsibilities of Congress. And if Congress does not step up to the plate, we are in trouble. Therefore, the 2020 midterms are going to be significantly important. So everybody today should go out and make sure you get your ballot. If you don't have your mail-in ballot, apply for your mail-in ballot. You haven't done so already. And the second point of the book is that the strategies that were used to entrench oil and gas sector is very much in violation of bipartisan values, of respect for the prudent decision-making of the private sector when there's no externality, respect for the rule of law, and so on. So there should be bipartisan support for the energy transition as there was before. If we think about it, the main mover of wind in Texas was Governor Bush, who then became President Bush. Think about Iowa and wind. It was Chuck Grassley, who's a Republican senator. So the values of protecting the environment while bringing forward our economic development is very much bipartisan.
Excellent. Thank you for that.
I would just add on Earth Day, I think many of our younger viewers would forget that things like the Environmental Protection Agency and the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act were enacted under Republican administration under President Nixon back in the late 60s and early 70s. So there's a very long tradition of environmental cooperation in the US that hope we can all get back to and draw upon as an inspiration going forward of, we do have enormous economic opportunities in this transition for American workers all across the country. To really take advantage of this. This is an area where the U.S. can lead the world on this, and we see this as an enormous potential benefit for communities all across the country.
And if you see the data from the state level, we can see renewable energy expansion in both red, blue, and purple states, making it very clear that the shift to renewable energy and a just transition is of a bipartisan, or one would say nonpartisan approach.
Right. There's an economic opportunity, economic responsibility, and in the simplest of terms for someone like me who's not an expert in this area, it's our shared home. So hopefully that can be a unifying factor in and of itself. And to that end, I know talking with a lot of young people and others in the community, there is a lot of climate despair because it is so dire and action is needed. At the same time, I've heard you both speak to hope and opportunity. So before we move into audience questions, and I see some are already coming in, so encouraging everyone to please share those. Can you each share one initiative that you're seeing on a national or regional level that's giving you hope for the future as it relates to this climate crisis? Steve, would you like to go first?
Sure, I'll jump in. I think one of the things that we're really focusing on in our international engagement is where do we have some quick wins? How can we really move the dial in the next 8 years as we look to 2030, where we said before we need to get our greenhouse gas emissions down by about 45% to keep us on track to get to net zero by 2050. And the two big things that we can do, and we're already making a lot of progress on this, is one is reducing methane emissions, which methane is a short-lived climate pollutant, which means it's a very, very powerful greenhouse gas, much more damaging to global warming than carbon dioxide is, but it has a much shorter life. Whereas carbon dioxide can exist in our atmosphere for centuries, methane is a much, much shorter lifespan. And so if we can reduce methane emissions now, a lot of them come from oil and gas facilities, simply, abandoned wells, which have not been properly capped, and so methane is leaking out, or pipelines, which are not properly sealed, and methane is leaking out into our atmosphere. These are relatively easy, low-cost fixes that we can make, significantly reduce impact on emissions from the oil and gas sector. But also a lot of methane emissions come from agriculture. There's a lot of fantastic work going on in the world of feed additives that we can give to cattle, which reduce methane emissions from cattle belching largely, is a significant factor in global warming. And simply scaling up these, and America is a great place where we have big cattle lots where we've got tens of thousands of cattle together eating. Simply just putting some additive, which is coming largely from seaweed, putting it in their feed can help their digestive system produce less methane. And so these things are, relatively simple solutions, not very expensive, which have a significant short-term impact. Another big area of work that we're working on and can be done in every community in this country and around the world is reforestation. As our forests are our lungs of the planet, making sure that we are stopping illegal deforestation. And we had a big pledge at Glasgow last year of countries around the world pledging to commit to the end of illegal deforestation by 2030, but also then reforesting and sustainable harvesting. So being smart going forward in terms of how we handle our forests. So work on methane and forests can have almost immediate impact on reducing the risk that we face of climate crisis.
Thank you, Shanti.
Okay, so the good news is that the National Academy of Sciences have published that we can actually achieve 75% decarbonization of our grid using existing technology of wind, solar, storage, and demand response. And this means that the technology is here. All we have to do is implement it. This is great news. And the second great news is that the cost of clean energy is dropping rapidly. And in many parts of the United States, generating electricity from new wind and solar is actually cheaper than generating electricity from an existing coal and natural gas plant. So in terms of the market and making a financial decision on renewable energy, it's clear cut. What we need to deal with is this soft costs and institutional barriers to shifting from fossil fuels to renewable energy. And with that, we do actually have to address incumbent industry interest, and we need to address that very difficult issue that we haven't talked about in this conversation, which is some of our politicians are not voting the way their voters want, and instead are voting in the interest of incumbent power sector and incumbent oil and gas sector. I think that should be part of our conversation on the energy transition.
Great. Thank you. Now let's turn to questions from the audience. So let's get started here with a question from our youth audience members. As you know, youth voice and leadership has been at the forefront of advocacy around climate crisis. So the first question is that climate change constantly appears in the news and science education, and students are taught from an early age about global warming and ecology. Despite this, many people still are unclear on the tangible ramifications of global warming. Could someone speak on the effects of a few degrees rise in global temperatures as they relate to everyday human life?
I'll let Shanti start on that.
Okay, so basic things to know about climate change. Climate change is here. It's man-made, but we have the ability to address climate change, right? So let's not frame it as this dire, unsolvable issue, because it is an issue where you cut down to the chase. We have the technological solutions. We have what we're missing now is the political solution, political will to implement some of these solutions, right? So in terms of immediate impact, if you are a farmer, you already notice in our region, farmers already notice that the droughts and heat are causing their crops to decline. Every one of us have been in extreme weather events. We are a very hilly terrain, which means flooding can cause landslides. And we remember Pennsylvania, the coast of Pennsylvania suffered from Hurricane Ida coming through. So it's here, it's now. But the good thing is we do have the solutions, as like, you know, the several minutes of conversation have emphasized.
Mm-hmm. Here.
Yeah, I would just add, I would add, you know, we used to say, you know, when I was a young pup, talking about, you know, there's this risk way in the future of climate change. And if we don't take action, things are going to be, as Shanti said, we are seeing those impacts right now. 2021 was July 2021 was the hottest month on record in across the planet. And over the last 60 years, every decade has been hotter than the one that came before it, with the past decade being the hottest in history. But we're contrasting to that. We're seeing that big cold snap from Texas to Nebraska last year, where temperatures were 40 degrees below zero and hundreds of people died in Texas from ice storms and loss of power and those sorts of things. Then we had wildfires in California, more than we've ever seen in the West. But then we had enormous flooding. So the phrase became reasonably common a few years ago, talking about moving away from global warming to global weirding, as we're seeing more and more extremes around the world. So farmers certainly are on the front end of this, but people who are living in communities that are surrounded by forests are seeing the impact. People living near the oceans are seeing the impact when we look at sea level rise and these sorts of things, which will have significant impact if we don't take action now. I remember one of the best presentations I went to was from sort of the chief climate scientist at NASA. You know, we often think of NASA as, you know, focused on putting people on Mars, but they do an enormous amount of observation of the Earth. And he made the analogy of thinking of a bathtub that's filling up with water. And as we approach this 1.5 degree level, suddenly the water starts to go over the tub. Now, we're not immediately going to drown with that water coming over the tub, but more and more water comes over if we don't turn off that tap. And so what we're trying to do in this by 2030 and then 2050 is turn that tap off so we're not producing more carbon dioxide, making the problem worse. So will we see an immediate change if we get to 1.6 degrees or 1.7? No, this is a sort of a spectrum that we see of changes, but we've sort of come to this international consensus that 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial level is the level where we can see that the temperatures or the impacts really accelerate if we go above that. And if we get way above where we were, a year or two ago, before we had a lot of effort last year to really make climate a priority around the world, we were on target for maybe a 2.7 degree or even higher 3.5 degree target. So we've come significantly down from there. Now, the International Energy Agency made an assessment at the end of last year saying if countries implement the promises they've made, that could keep us to 1.8 degrees above pre-industrial. Not quite exactly where we want to be, but much closer than 3.5 was. So we are making progress already. But as Shanti said, it's an issue now of political will. Can we follow through around the world on the pledges that we have made? So we know what we need to do. We know how to do it. Can and will we do it?
And youth have a big voice in this. So just to follow up on we have now the Build Back Better plan in Congress. It's passed the House. It needs to pass the Senate. So youth can look up very easily on the line what are the provisions under Build Back Better, how they would actually address climate change. And you can also look at polling, which shows that voters, for example, voters in West Virginia, agree to the provisions support the provisions in the Build Back Better plan. But at the moment, politicians who represent fossil fuel communities have not been on board the way the voters in fossil fuel communities have been on board for addressing climate change.
Thanks for those points. We'll come back to other questions from youth, but I want to turn to a different audience member now who's asking, can the speakers comment on the longer term role that hydrogen, H2, could play, whether electrolysis, such as capital investment towards surplus renewables beyond the electric grid demands, whether those will become cost effective or whether natural gas or coal-based syngas reforming, or perhaps with carbon and capture, will gain traction.
So this is amazing because Erica Strasberger and Sarah Inamarato, along with the Ohio River Valley Institute, held a public information session yesterday from 7 to 9. It went on because people were very interested in this question. So I would suggest to audience members, and you can post this later, to look at that webinar because it actually went into tremendous details about the risk and reward of doing hydrogen. And the short answer is that we need hydrogen for the very, very narrow, hard to decarbonize industries. So investment in hydrogen makes sense for that narrow set of issues where it's hard to decarbonize industry. And the presentation also showed that it is far cheaper to do, for example, electrification of vehicles rather than relying on hydrogen for vehicles. So it tells us very clearly that hydrogen can be a solution for a limited number of problems, but the focus should still be on electrification and on the shift to renewable energy. In other words, beware of false promises.
And just to clarify, just one clarification for folks joining us outside of Pittsburgh, Erica Strasberger is a city council person in the city of Pittsburgh, and Sarah Inamarato is a PA state representative. So thanks for that mention, and we'll be sure to include those links. Steve?
Yeah, I would just add on the international stage, hydrogen is an area where we're looking and having a lot of conversations with partners around the world, as our European friends, our Australian friends, India, looking very closely at this. As Shanti said, a lot of potential in hydrogen, But like a lot of emerging technologies, there will be a lot of ups and downs and bumps and curves in the road before we get there. And just the longer I'm not a scientist by training. I'm a foreign policy person and a recovering lawyer. But one of my favorite charts I printed out, I just actually got off, is called The Colors of the Hydrogen Rainbow. That talks about the differences between, we hear green hydrogen, blue hydrogen, gray hydrogen, brown hydrogen, where the sources are coming from. And my favorite one, very optimistic, and turquoise hydrogen. So we have many, many different sort of technical ways to produce hydrogen, some of which are very clean, some of which are not as clean. And so it will not be a silver bullet probably based on the technology and understanding we have now, but it is an area of very, very active research and collaboration around the world.
I think we also need to remember that, if we look at the IPCC report, it says that we need to reduce emissions quickly, right? So our focus should be on what is the cost-effective way to get there and get there quickly. Yeah. And given that the National Academy of Sciences has said that, we can get to 75% decarbonization using existing technology, I think a focus on deployment for those makes sense. And then, of course, you want to do R&D, continue to do R&D on hydrogen for the hard to decarbonize industries.
Great. Let's turn back to youth question. So often the climate crisis, as Shanti was suggesting earlier, can seem so large scale, and this is the question from a high school student. Often the crisis can seem so large scale and long term that it seems overwhelming. What are some steps that youth can take in order to help protect the environment and foster a more sustainable future? To either of you.
Okay. I'll go. So I recommend very much Googling for Katherine Hayhoe, Hayhoe, and she's the person behind Global Weirding. And her message is that the best thing to do is to take action. When you take action, you have hope. You're not dwelling in despair. And the second issue is Michael Mann, author of Climate War. He has actually explained to us how the newest strategy of climate denial is really to have climate doomism, where we become so in despair that we take no action. And I think youth are amazing because they have the information. They are studying the stuff in school. And believe it or not, they are probably far more informed than the people around them. So they, by talking about climate change, by talking about climate action, by bringing up this legislation that we have in Congress, the Build Back Better plan, legislation that we have in Pennsylvania, to their parents, to their families, can do a huge work in terms of just informing the public. As you know, misinformation is a huge piece of why we don't have bigger climate action, right? So youth can play a huge role in this. And I would suggest that everyone watches PBS Frontline, which has a documentary on climate change. I think it's called Big Oil, something like that. But I have tremendous hope and tremendous evidence hoped in youth to bring the challenge forward.
Hear, hear. Steve.
Yeah, I would agree 100% that this is certainly not a situation to despair, but I think a situation for young people to feel empowered, that they really can make a difference. And just looking at some research data from 2020, the Pew Charitable Trust, probably the most respected polling agency in the country, 80% of Americans support tougher restrictions on power plant carbon dioxide emissions. 70% support taxing corporations based on carbon emissions. 71% support tougher fuel efficiency standards for cars. So I think there are significant majorities of people today in the US who really see this as a priority. Of course, ultimately, people will need to make their voices heard. And for those of your viewers who are 18 and above, certainly, if this is a priority issue for you, when you're looking at, voting, whether it's, the federal level, state level, county level, municipal level, making sure that you are looking for candidates who support your views and really want to prioritize climate policy as a priority for action. That this is certainly an opportunity to get involved politically, but also involved engaging with businesses and corporations around you and asking those questions, being that persistent voice that is saying, what is your plan to deal with climate change? How is your company, how is your business, how is this city, this county planning to deal with these issues that I and my friends and classmates will be dealing with for the remainder of our lives, and sort of really forcing that conversation into the open, because I think data shows that a significant majority of people support, bold action on climate for a variety of reasons, but to really take action. And I think this is a time to inspire and empower young people.
And even within a group of voters, you can see that the younger voters have stronger support for climate action than the extremely older voters. And that makes sense, because I'm sort of like going to die off before like the worst of climate change comes. But the younger generation are going to be exposed to it completely, right? So the youth have a self-interest in pushing for climate action. And if you think about climate litigation, that's another thing that's going on. There's a case called Juliana, and I forget the entire name of the case, but you can see how climate litigation by the youth now is another avenue where young people are making a difference. And just to back this idea about please vote. Primaries in Pennsylvania is May 19th or May something, very soon. So please sign up to vote if you're 18 and above.
Excellent. And as has been said many, many times, it takes all of us. It's going to take every single one of us across ages. Yes, young people are already leading now, but there's also the sense of responsibility and frustration that they've inherited this. So what are the rest of us going to do alongside with young people to address climate action? You have both given us so much in terms of resources and steps that can be taken. We are going to come to a close now and pause there. Sorry if we couldn't get to all of your questions, but thank you so much to Steve and Shanti for your insight. Thank you to all for joining us today and for caring about the world and this incredibly timely and important issue. I'd also like to thank the Public Affairs Officer in the Bureau of Global Public Affairs in the U.S. Department of State, Irina Karmanova, who helped to make this event possible today. There is much more to cover on this topic and other global issues. If you enjoyed today's program, please follow us on social media, visit our website, worldpittsburgh.org, to learn more about our upcoming programs, and come celebrate with us on June 9th for our spring soiree fundraiser. Programs like today are made possible thanks to all of you, so please consider becoming a monthly subscriber. Thank you to everyone, wishing you all peace and happy Earth Day. Until next time, thank you.